The batch of 2021 from the National University of Singapore Masters of Architecture program is proud to present our thesis work from the past year. Let's look through the virtual exhibition and our 5 clusters.
The Technologies cluster posits that architecture cannot be divorced from the techniques which inform it. From orthographic drawing to computer-aided design tools to computational design methods and VR worlds, the methods of making architecture have constantly evolved, and the worlds that architects design also include the virtual realms that an increasing number of digital natives are beginning to inhabit. Projects by April and Weijie respond to new technologies such as artificial intelligence or digital footprints. April's project studies the impact of artificial intelligence in the urban and economic fabric of Shenzhen, while Weijie traces and augments the intimate spatial procession of a crematorium with the data footprints left behind in a person's life. Virtual reality and augmented reality are also explored by Matthew, Thomas and Ziwei, who translate spatial and architectural ideas for the new media in the design of a message board, a dementia treatment process, and to study the amalgamation of physical and digital spaces, therefore applying architectural ideas to virtual experiences. Finally, web-based tools by Anna and Derek also utilize web-based platforms to generate new tools that reach masses of people, to study perceptions of Singaporeans not in my backyard mentalities, or to smoothen the participatory design process. The thesis of this cluster attempt to reimagine the architect in this data-driven world. While technology's evolution may occur at an ever-accelerating pace, the works respond to the zeitgeist of the 21st century and the increasing blend between the digital, the material, and the architectural.
Now, let's move on to our largest cluster, urbanism and environments. We take on the position that architecture is ecological. It mediates the relationship between human and environment by engaging it with vast networks of stakeholders, processes, and relationships beyond our immediate and perceptible senses. Our projects are split into 3 subclusters, according to explored themes and concerns. The Reimagining subcluster designs for unprecedented events, projecting futures in which their architectures lie, so as to critically examine the present. The Filter City Master Plan is a combined studio effort to propose new typologies, economic systems and public spaces that have become insufficient due to the pandemic's need for containment and recovery. Sherry's Residences scheme absorbs urban public space and its vibrancy into the domestic sphere, while Bernie's retail and manufacturing arm proposes a granularized layered typology that overhauls the previously linear and isolated manufacturer-to-consumer line. The Reconciling subcluster seeks new synergies between man and environments, redefining the boundaries between the natural and the artificial. Joanne does this in her thesis Designing Consequence, where she relinquishes control to natural cycles and growths, allowing our typically manicured forms of nature to consume our built environments. Architecture is found in studies of botany, material textility, and hydrologic landscapes. The Resourcing cluster assesses our resources through new ways of consumption and production. In Keith's Feed Forward, architecture becomes a vehicle for food and produce management, but also a means to dissect and mold community values, culture, and consumer mindsets. In the material field, Valerie centers investigations around the found recyclable object and its intimate interactions with each other and the body. She blurs the boundaries and inverses hierarchies between object, architecture, and body. In the face of increasing urbanization, climate change, and global crisis, such as the ongoing pandemic, architecture must seek new ways of mediating between inhabitants and their environments. No longer must we refer to insular standards of measure or methods within the discipline, but instead take root across multiple bodies of knowledge that expand the scope of architecture and foreground the collaborative role of the architects.
Works within the sociopolitics and geopolitics cluster interrogate architecture's capacity to contribute to the public good. Architecture may be tied to established norms of economy, society, politics, and the built environment, both the product and cause of the status quo. The thesis proposed, however, that architectural thinking and intervention can equally upset perceived spatial injustices for the better. They are divided in our exhibition into ministries, each one focused on a type of provocation. Ita's Sin Paradise Town imagines an independent town within Singapore, a free space within a restrictive society. It is deliberately speculative and imaginative, but then, by situating it against the MBS, itself a free zone for vice, it serves as a critique masked as a proposal. Xiao Wei's thesis, Chinatown, a green light district, comes from a similar angle, looking at spaces of free speech. But instead of the singular satirical beacon, it attempts to realize it by coexisting with socio-spatial tension, occupying unlikely corners of the urban streetscape, behind back alleys and disappearing into food courts. Other projects move along similar lines of inquiry, moving across the boundaries of architecture to raise and tackle various chosen issues. Ahmad Nazaruddin's Pleasure Fields imagines a park for cruising, part architecture, part clothing. Rachel Sim, attempting to redress electoral imbalance, designs everyday objects which serve hidden functions in political walkabouts. These theses are fundamentally optimistic, at a time when architecture in practice seems all the more constrained by structures of capital and power. These explorations strive to reassert the power of design, attempting to make a difference in the world.
Our History and Heritage cluster is formed by a relatively small group of students. While the name of the cluster immediately brings to mind conservation, the works of this cluster vary greatly. The students have concerned themselves with stories, often those not immediately apparent or recognizable, and forgotten sites across many scales. They negotiate the demands of past and present, often at odds in different ways. For example, Dong-Eun's project, dealing with difficult heritage, attempts to find and conserve the very idea of islandness itself on Sorokdo, through 6 relatively small piers distributed around the perimeter of the island. On the other hand, Hui Ling, in a case for the Kampong spirit, acknowledges the weakness of architecture from the outset. She asks how architecture and the notion of preserving a certain spirit of place can make do in a pragmatic country, which she answers by embedding artifacts from the past within the new. The themes of this cluster are particularly pertinent given the growing interest in conservation in Singapore today. Just last year, for example, Golden Mile Complex was proposed for conservation, a milestone for modern architecture and perhaps indicative of a wider paradigm shift. These thesis-level proposals are thus the tip of an iceberg. We will no doubt see the floodgates open in view of the new architectural conservation masters.
Welcome to our cluster titled Critical Architecture, one of the 5 clusters in the NUS Masters of Architecture Show 2021. Despite our discipline's tendency to put up an impressive facade, our cluster grapples with architecture as a weak discipline, as compared to other disciplines which are more elemental and pure. Yet, it is within this weak discipline that students are able to destabilize conventions, employ different methods of inquiry, and to redefine architecture and expand its boundaries. Some projects question the reliance towards line drawings as a representation of architecture, borrowing and experimenting with novel ways of representation to create new design methodologies. In a discretized mosque, Zulkarnain analyzes spatial representation in film by translating the experience of film into drawing, where architecture is read as a collection of discrete spaces that form a whole, rather than as a whole partitioned into fragments. Zul applies this formal operation in the design of a mosque, displaying the connection between architecture and its methods of representation. The cluster is critical of conventional values in the discipline that run deep. Seriousness, objectivity, and logic have taken precedence, and other values are suppressed or hidden. Amelia's project, translating the subconscious, plays with subjectivity and the subconscious as methods of design, values that have always been inherently in architecture but not positioned as protagonists within the discipline. Working through intuition and memory and translating them into hand movements that mold clay, Amelia proposes architecture as an operation that embraces the subjective and subconscious, culminating in fascinating 1:1 scale objects that are also scale models of pavilions. In many ways, the discipline of architecture is defined by a dynamic equilibrium, requiring constant re-evaluation rather than existing as a stable state. We hope that our inquiry in critical architecture never ends, to thrive as conversations, thesis projects, and creative works in the future. Thank you for your support for the M.ARCH Show 2021 Intersection series. We hope that you will enjoy our works and join us in our weekly online dialogues. We look forward to celebrating, learning, and sharing new ideas with you all.